Well, good morning. I want to welcome all of you. I'm Todd Moss here at the Center for Global Development. We wanted Tendai to feel at home, so we had a major infrastructure breakdown in central Washington, D.C. this morning. So there was a water main break at Metro Center that shut down 3 subway lines. We had over 150 RSVPs this morning, so we were expecting a packed house, and I think that the Metro held up a number of people. So you're a hearty bunch, and thank you for making this event. I'm really very pleased to have Tendai Biti with us here for a discussion on roadblocks, recovery, and relapse in Zimbabwe. Very quickly, I want to say, why would the Center for Global Development, why do we care about Zimbabwe? We've taken a long interest in Zim as a very promising country that unfortunately has become a fragile state in many respects. The country's had the worst economic collapse in modern times outside of a war. And just at a time when African economies are booming, the Africa Rising narrative is becoming more common, Zimbabwe actually experienced 11 years in a row of shrinking economy. And of course, Zimbabwe's had a very difficult, tense relationship with this town and with the Western world more generally. A couple of years ago, Stuart Patrick, who's now at the Council on Foreign Relations, he and I did a paper on what lessons from post-conflict recovery we could apply to a country like Zimbabwe because of the extreme conditions that it's undergone. And then my great colleague Ben Leo and I did a paper in 2009 about how Zimbabwe could escape from $5 to $6 billion in external debt that we'll probably hear a little bit about from Tendai. And now we're truly honored to have Tendai join the center as a visiting fellow. I think most of you know Tendai. He's a leading lawyer, a founding member of the Movement for Democratic Change, and a member of Parliament. He was finance minister 2009 to 2013, and under his tenure, he ended hyperinflation. He began to restore fiscal stability, began to restore public services, and began to restore growth. And he left after the elections 2 summers ago. We're really thrilled to have him join us here. And the reason we invited Tendai to be a visiting fellow were twofold. One, we wanted to give somebody like Tendai, who is an amazing policy thinker and reformer, some space, some distance from the day-to-day crises in Zimbabwe, some space from the challenges in Harare, to think a bit long-term, to just to have that space to reflect on his own experiences and to think a little bit more long-term about Zimbabwe's future. And then more selfishly, we wanted to have Tendai here so we could learn from his experience, that he could give us insights as we're thinking about U.S. and the Western world's engagement with a whole range of countries that face difficult governance challenges, and what could we learn from some of the successes and some of the shortcomings of our relations with Zimbabwe. I'm also extremely thrilled to have Caroline Lambert here, who's going to moderate this discussion. I've known Caroline for many, many years. We worked together in London a long time ago. She was a journalist for The Economist in Southern Africa. She collaborated here at the center with Nuhu Rabadu in his 2010 CGD book called Show Me the Money, which is online, and that's about Nuhu Rabadu's experience as the anti-corruption czar in Nigeria. Caroline is now a visiting fellow here at the center, and I'm proud to say is a co-author with me and Stephanie Mierovic on a book called Oil to Cash, which is in its final edit stages and will be coming out early next year, which is on cash transfers in countries that have natural resource windfalls. So Caroline's going to moderate a discussion with Tendai for about 30 minutes, and we'll open it up to the floor for discussion. And I hope we'll learn something and have fun. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Todd, for the introduction. I'm Caroline Lambert. As Todd experienced, I'm a recovering journalist, and I am so happy to be here today with Tendai. I was reflecting that we first met almost 10 years ago when I was writing about Zimbabwe, and I thought we would start there. If you could tell us what the situation was like in Zimbabwe and what challenges the country was facing in 2008, just at the eve of the election and just before you became finance minister.
Thank you, Caroline, and good morning, everyone. 2008 was a meltdown year. It was an extremely difficult period for Zimbabweans and Zimbabwe as a country. You had the scourge of hyperinflation. Our month-on-month inflation was over 1 million%. The last official figure of inflation taken by the government in July of 2008, official inflation was 231 million%. By December of 2008, official inflation was 500 billion%. The second highest figure after Hungary in 1956. But the real frightening figures are to do with the social indices. You had maternal mortality rates of something like 91 out of 1,000. Infant mortality rates of 85 out of 1,000. So that's a really soft genocide. There was absolutely no food and goods in the supermarkets. So you had supermarkets that were forced to open, but there were no goods in the supermarket. Our people were dying. The official figures from the Ministry of Health were 4,000 deaths per month, and that's just too high. Children were not going to school, hospitals had shut down. We had a cholera outbreak where 140,000 people were affected, 4,000 people died. So it was a very difficult place to live. But two things, shortage of food and hyperinflation, I think were the defining period, the defining things of that era.
Okay. Then the 2008 election took place. It was, as we all know, a very difficult time. And a government of national unity took over. You became finance minister. Faced with such intractable challenges, and as you've just mentioned, hyperinflation going really through the roof to unprecedented level, and no food. Where did you start? How did you manage to that situation, and what were the priorities?
It was an extremely challenging situation. I got to the Ministry of Finance on the 16th of February, 2009. And as I say in the essay that I've done for the center, after greetings, the budget director, Fungwa Kunaka, says to me, Minister, tomorrow is payday. Oh, it's payday. How much do we have to pay? $30 million US. How much do we have in the bank? $4 million. So I said to him, so Mr. Kunak, where are we going to get the $26 million? Minister, we're waiting for you. And that's so the extent and scope of the challenges were very clear, even from that mandate. But I'd been thinking about the economy before and working on the economy before. And to me, there were always going to be two things. The first, self-evidently, was always going to be hyperinflation. The second was always going to be the issue of the availability of food in the supermarkets. And if you manage to resolve these things, you would also, in a way, resolve the other attendant structural problems, i.e. the problem of social delivery, for instance, the problem of productivity. We had companies that He had shut down, that were shutting down with the problems of unemployment. So I knew that if I directed my attention on these two critical focal points, I'm also dealing with the other challenges. But I also realized even on day one that we needed a plan, that we needed a compass to direct us from the economic challenges which we were facing. So right on that very first day, that Monday, we actually started crafting the short-term emergency recovery program, STEP, which was a key plan to direct us out of the economic quagmire that we faced. Part of the obvious challenges with our situation was the question of the Zimbabwean dollar. The Zimbabwean dollar had become an instrument of arbitrage, a vehicle of pauperizing of our people. So part of delegitimizing the Zimbabwean dollar was an obvious solution. And killing the Zimbabwean dollar was one of the key things that we had to do. We had no choice. It was not out of being clever or wise. We simply had to do to kill the Zimbabwean dollar. So there were a number of things that we had to do. And part of the challenge of being in a fragile state is that you have got inelastic demands. You have got high expectations, but there's simply no fiscal legroom. So your biggest challenge is in this massive ocean of priorities. How do you actually prioritize the top priorities? And how do you actually implement? In the first 2 years, we tried to do everything, but ended up doing very few things. So at the end of the day, the question is, what are the actual priorities? And do they actually make a difference at the end of the day? So you are juggling at every given time.
Okay. You mentioned killing the Zimbabwean dollar to tackle hyperinflation. There was also challenges related to controlling or regaining control of government spending. Could you tell us more about that? How you went about doing that?
When I got into government, since 2004, there'd been a massive reliance on a monetary policy. You now call it quantitative easing. We used to call it quasi-fiscal activities. So this was a situation where there was a lot of printing of money in order to monetize the budget deficit, monetize the fiscal deficit. So by 2007, quasi-fiscal activities were 23% of GDP. By 2008, they were 34% of GDP. So government had actually shifted from the Ministry of Finance to the Reserve Bank. And because we always thought that we could print ourselves out of a crisis, you had a disease, which I call in this paper fiscalitis, the belief that money grows on trees and you can just spend. And clearly it doesn't work like that. So I found a very lax fiscal attitude. You know, people just accrue obligations, but nobody is concerned about where the money is coming from. So right from the word go, I realized that we had to impose a new DNA, a new culture. And I coined it in my I revised the budget on the 17th of March, 2009. And I introduced this concept, we eat what we kill. If we kill a rat, we obviously must be prepared to eat a rat. We can't kill a rat and expect to have the party of an elephant. So it was very rudimentary, but I think it worked. The idea was that we need to balance the books. We need a primary balance. We need a fiscal balance. So the concept of we eat what we kill is something that we lived through during the time of the inclusive government. And for me, the average Zimbabwean hates borrowing. We are very much afraid of debt. So trying to import that culture, certainly the Ministry of Finance, they were takers. But it's something that really helped us because at any given time, our books could balance. We ate what we killed.
So one side of balancing that budget was to eat less, but the other side was also to then try to increase revenue. So how did you manage to do that, both domestic revenues, but also rebuilding bridges with donors and trying to get assistance from the international community?
Revenues are generated from the supply side, from an economy that is actually functioning. When I became finance minister in 2009, there was a lot of dirigism. There was a lot of suffocating policy measures. The biggest one was the export surrender requirements. So all companies that were exporting were forced to surrender 15 to 20% of their export earnings. So one of the first things that I did was to remove that. There were also price controls. One of the ways that the Eswell government had tried to deal with the inflation or hyperinflation was to actually control inflation by arresting captains of industry, putting them in prison and so forth. There was a commission called the Prices and Incomes Commission. So they would literally go into a shop and simply say the price of this flat screen television is now 40 billion US dollars. So I had to remove. We had to remove that as well. So removing these suffocating policy measures on industry allowed industry to breathe. The other thing that we also did was to have a moratorium on tax evasion and tax avoidance. So we simply said, if you've not been paying tax, we're not going to ask questions. Just come and pay taxes. So because of this, we actually had a dramatic increase in our revenue. So we collected $4 million in January of 2009, $15 million in February of 2009, $30 million in March of 2009. By June 2009, we were collecting 90 million US dollars of income. So there was a rapid exponential growth in our revenue, simply because we allowed incentives, we gave incentives to the productive sector to actually start producing again. And when I got into government, capacity utilization was between 2 and 4%. By the end of the year, our capacity utilization in some of the industries was actually around 45%, and in the food and beverages industries and the furniture industries, it was actually 80%. So the simple issue was really to say wealth and surplus is created by production, and how do we allow companies to breathe again and to produce again and to generate surplus and wealth, and that's what we did.
One point of contention also had to do with mining, and in particular diamond mining, which was so key to government revenues. Can you tell us more about that?
The story of extractive industries in Africa is a sad story. There will always be, diamonds aside, there will always be a mismatch between the value and the wealth that is created from extractive industries, from the mining sector, from the commodity sector, and what actually goes into the national coffers, and also the expectations of the country, which is where the extraction is taking place. And for Zimbabwe and most of Africa, this is very unfortunate, because 100 years 50 years after colonialism, we have failed as African states to actually alter the accumulation model. It's still based on extraction, either either in agriculture, cocoa or tobacco, or in minerals, diamonds and platinum. And it explains, I think it's at the root of Africa's underdevelopment. But in the case of diamonds in Zimbabwe, there were other subjective things. We as a country were a shareholder in the diamond companies that were extracting our diamonds in Anjin, in Mbada, in Marange. We're a 50% shareholder. So that means that over and above corporate income tax, payee, royalties, we were actually due the dividend of a shareholder. But unfortunately, we never got that. I reckon that we were generating, our diamond mines were generating an average of US $2 billion a year. But what was coming to Treasury was an average of US $45 million a year, saving 1 year, 2010, where we actually got $274 million. The situation has not changed now. It's still the position now. In the first half of the year, diamond revenue was a mere $30 million US in 2014. So there's a lot of arbitrage, there's a lot of rent-seeking activity, and it doesn't benefit the nation. But compare that with Botswana. Botswana is a diamond economy. Like Zimbabwe, the gross income of the Botswana diamond industry is $2 billion per year, but they get at least 60% of that income. And look at the development of Botswana. In real terms, Botswana has been growing at the rate of 6% per annum in the last 5 years, bar 2008 and 9, because of the global economic crisis, where they had a growth rate of minus 2%. But other than that, they've been able to use their diamonds to grow their economy. We can't do that, and we fail to do that in Zimbabwe.
Besides trying to generate more domestic revenues, another part of the budget equation was, and of the recovery equation, was to also try to rebuild relationship with at least part of the international community. I understand you've had a mixed experience with various donors, and I was wondering whether you could share your thoughts about what worked well and what worked not so well with donors.
Yeah, when I became finance minister, I think one of the self-evident realities was the fact that we had to build bridges with the international community. A normal country operates on the basis of what is called a fiscal triangle. So in an average African country, you depend on revenues as your primary source of income. Then you need foreign direct investment. Then you need overseas development assistance as part of your fiscal triangle. We only had our own domestic revenues, and our people are overtaxed. Zimbabwe, the ratio of our revenue to GDP is 29%, even higher than South Africa. The average African country, Sierra Leone, Zambia, Uganda, it's 16%. So our people are overtaxed. So to write the fiscal triangle, it was so key that there had to be international engagement. And I realized that whether I liked it or not, I had to be a de facto assistant minister of foreign affairs, whether I liked it or not. And one of the key things as well was that we had a sovereign debt in excess of $7 billion US dollars. You can't repudiate. There's no such thing, such as odious debt. If you are sitting in a little tiny ministry of finance, you can't repudiate that. So quite clearly, the question of engagement with Washington, the question of engagement with the World Bank and the IMF was going to be key. Zimbabwe had withdrawn from the IMF as way back as 2003, the last mission of the IMF had been in Zimbabwe in 2006. Our voting rights had been suspended in 2004. So part of the biggest task that I had was to restore relations between Harare and Washington. And one of my immediate targets was to restore our voting rights. So that meant countless trips to and countless engagement with Washington. And I was very pleased that on the 19th of February 2010, our voting rights were restored. Then, of course, was the question of the debt. How do we deal with the question of debt? And to me, the question of debt was never about repaying the debt. We had defaulted as way back as 1999 anyway. And to be honest, it would be very stupid for a minister of finance in a fragile state in Africa to try and repay $7 billion when your budget is $1 billion and you have got the massive problems that we had, per capita income of $200, massive underdevelopment, no infrastructure. So the question is, what model do you come up with which creates a win-win situation? It creates a win-win situation with the creditors. It also creates a win-win situation in your own country in terms of your own developmental aspirations. And that meant engagement. That meant dialogue with the World Bank, with the IMF, but with also the creditor countries in the Paris Club, the private creditors in the London club. But of course, these things are ideological. These things are political. I was in an inclusive government where one part of the government would not hear the discourse of hippie and everything that was labeled neoliberal. So you had to move mountains to persuade colleagues that yes, we could actually engage. They are not going to take over government. We're not surrendering our sovereign right to H Street, to Washington, and that was a struggle. But we fought, and I'm pleased to say that we managed to sign an SMP in July of 2013, and I'm pleased to say that the current government has extended that SMP to now an SMP 2, because that's the only way to go. It's not about debt, it's about development, and we need to access the huge amounts of money that are in the World Bank, that are in the African Development Bank. But that's part of the dialogue. Part of the dialogue also related to building bridges with the developmental agencies like your USAID, DFID, and so forth. That meant that we had to talk to these capitals. So part of my mandate was to ensure that Zimbabwe was reintegrated in the community of nations. But it's also a quid pro quo. If we want to be respected as an equal member of the international community as Zimbabwe, it's not a one-way street. It also means that we have to have free and fair elections. We have to stop arresting our citizens, brutalizing our citizens. We have to adhere to constitutionalism and the rule of law. So we have to answer those difficult questions, and we have to answer those difficult questions as well.
After 4 years of government of national unities, what is your, and now with hindsight, what is your take on the achievements, but also the shortcomings? Do you have any regrets?
I think that scholars, academics should spend a lot of time on coalition governments or unity governments on the African continent. The challenge with Africa, much of Africa, whether it's places like Chad, the Central African Republic, the Gambia, Equatorial Guinea, Somalia, Eritrea, Ethiopia, is that we have had exclusive, extractive politics, winner-take-all politics, zero-sum politics. And the state and the control over the state is an arena of personal accumulation. I have to be a president because being president means that I guarantee the right of my family to accumulate, and accumulation for the sake of accumulation, the right of my tribe to eat as it were. So as a result, the balance sheet of post-independent Africa has been a sad one. We have not been inclusive. So the tenure of the experiment of inclusive governments is an experiment in inclusivity, something that we are not very good at as Africans, working together, irrespective of our difference. We have executed, particularly post-independent Africa, we have executed very exclusive politics on the basis of very exclusive, weak institutions, and that's not good enough. So the positives from the inclusive government is that we were able to talk together, we were able to talk to each other. We had the JOMIC, the Joint Monitoring Implementation Committee. We had Parliament itself and the Constitutional Committee on Parliament, COPAC, that gave rise to the new constitution. We had the organ for national healing. And in some ways, we learned to that apart from violence, there are other instruments of actually resolving political differences. Part of the challenge in Africa is that we use violence as the key instrument of political arbitration. It doesn't matter whether it's Rwanda, it doesn't matter whether it's the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo. It doesn't matter whether it's Burundi. Violence is or Sierra Leone or Liberia. Violence is a quick and easy instrument of arbitrating difference. And in my experience, in the last 15 years, there is no option and there is no alternative to dialogue. So the inclusive government allowed us to dialogue, allowed us to know each other. But I think the tragedy of the inclusive government is that we did not lay foundations for common convergence, for a common vision that would make the work we did in the 4.5 years irreversible. And because we didn't lay the foundations in a very short period of time, what we did was reversed. And there's been a continuation of predatory politics. There's been a continuation of exclusive politics, even to this very day. And I think that is the greatest failure of the inclusive government. There's other unfinished business on the economy. I've written about that in the economy, or in the paper that I've written. There are many things that we should have done to make sure that even the economic progress that we're making, we should have made it irreversible. So I've got regrets about that. I've got regrets about not fulfilling and finishing the work with the World Bank on our debt, for instance, the reform agenda, reform of parastatal, reform of the public service matrix, reform of the banking sector, reform of the insurance sector. Those are big regrets, but I think the biggest regrets are on the political front, on the nation building front. We failed to put foundations for a sustainable Zimbabwe, a sustainable nation. And that to me is my biggest regret.
So what are the prospects on both these things, on building a solid foundation for economic recovery, but also to solve political challenges in Zimbabwe? What are the prospects of that happening? What needs to happen both at home, but also what can the international community do, if anything, to assist that process?
I think before I talk about the international community, I think I must emphasize that the problem and challenge of Zimbabwe is for Zimbabweans. We can't outsource this to anyone, to the international community. We can't outsource this. It is our challenge. I think that we as Zimbabweans have got the duty, obligation, and imperative of resolving our problems. I think that we can't look to the generation of Mugabe. It has failed and failed dismally. I think that other generations too have failed us. And I think that it is up to the younger generations, and fortunately, 60% of Zimbabweans are under the age of 35 years. So maybe we need to reap a democratic dividend and get back to basic, re-strategize, start a new dialogue that puts Zimbabweans first and not individuals and not big personalities. Let's reconstruct a new vision. Let's find common convergence on the economy, for instance. It's not a crime to belong to different political parties, but it is certainly a crime not to find a common vision of Zimbabweanhood. I was saying to yourself and other people that we possibly need to revisit Thomas Jefferson and find our own Thomas Jefferson as Zimbabweans. If we were to write a Zimbabwean declaration of nationhood, what kind of things would we take as self-evident that would put in this document that would capture the Grundnorm of Zimbabweanhood? To me, as a person who has been in the trenches, the issue of the rule of law is critical. The issue of poverty is critical. The issue of living in a society that doesn't fear, because Zimbabwe is a captive society, we are captive to fear, is critical. The issue of building a society that is free from violence and torture and personal abuse is critical. But it must also be a nation founded on values. Yes, the liberation movement is okay. So it's part of our value. We must recognize that. But so too the values of transparency, of solidarity and equality and so forth. The many beautiful things which we talk about in our new constitution. So unless we have this common convergence, we'll have a problem. So we need to find a common convergence. And unfortunately, it's not going to be done by the generation of Mugabe. They failed us. They did their part. So we have to go back to the drawing board. We don't do a lot of thinking as Zimbabweans because we're busy firefighting. We're busy trying to eke out a living. The average Zimbabwean has to worry about the absence of electricity, the existence of potholes, the absence of water from tapes and so forth, the absence of inputs and so forth. So eking out a day-to-day living is a challenge on its own. But we certainly have to think and find this convergence. The international community can help us and has always helped us. Starting with SADC, I think that it's very important that SADC does not lose sight of the fact that by virtue of Zimbabwe being a member of the Southern African Development Community of the African Union, there are certain obligations that membership entails. And that those obligations include the obligation to the rule of law, to constitutionalism, the obligation to feed our citizens, to clothe our citizens, which things we are not doing very well at the present moment in time. The rest of the international community, we are part of the UN. We are a member of the UN, so we are bound by the 1948 Charter, and it has obligations too. It would be very wrong for anyone to think that you can deal with Zimbabwe merely on the matrix of accommodation, not on the matrix of full responsibility, rights and obligations. So everyone has a role, but I want to emphasize that the primary role is with us Zimbabweans. We have to look the beast in the eye and not blink. Unfortunately, we are blinking most of the time at the present moment in time.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to open it up for questions now. So a few ground rules. If you could please first introduce yourself. Try to be as brief as possible so that we give everybody a chance to ask questions. And last thing is actually ask a question. So I'll take 3 at a time. The gentleman there, you, and in the blue shirt over there.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. I am Ed Barber from GoodWorks International, a consultancy founded by Andy Young. I followed Zimbabwe for years, including before this in the U.S. Treasury, and I read the other day that Emerson Mnangagwa had been appointed deputy president. He is a former security chief and I believe even a former finance minister. I was wondering what recognizing this could be a sensitive subject, I was wondering what you might be able to say about the possible consequences for the issues you've been talking about, economic policy, relations with donors and investors, generational change, and so on. Thank you, sir.
Hi, my name is Julie Craig. I'm with the Center for International Private Enterprise. We've been trying to work with the business community in Zimbabwe to look at areas for economic reform, and there's many opportunities, but it's not clear as to what can move forward. And putting on your financial hat, I'm curious as to, given the current political environment, where you see kind of perhaps quick wins with economic reforms that could possibly be moved forward within the next year. Thank you.
Okay, the gentleman. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Brooks Marmon. I'm with the Accountability Lab. I was interested to learn that you are a visiting fellow here. Last I had heard in the news, you were leading a sort of renewal of the MDC. So I'm interested in learning more about specific goals during the fellowship, and specifically in regards to what you hope to accomplish within DC regarding the renewal of the MDC.
Thank you.
Yes, yeah, thank you. Well, the events in ZANU-PF which have led to the elevation of Emerson Mnangagwa have been rapid, have been very fluid, and I think have caught a lot of people by surprise. Many would hope that this is the end of the succession battle, because the succession issue in ZANU-PF has actually put a premium on the country. And the succession issue in ZANU-PF is not an internal issue. It affects the country. The economy has paid a price because all eyes have been on this acerbic issue. But I think for me, the future of Zimbabwe is not so much what happens in ZANU-PF. ZANU-PF has been in power since the last 35 years. And the balance sheet of ZANU-PF speaks for itself. We are still one of the poorest countries on the continent, notwithstanding our huge resources. We are our per capita income, our growth rates, those figures speak for themselves. So what the future for Zimbabwe, I think, lies, number one, in actually coming together through a coalition of winners that can find a common matrix of convergence on the key national questions. And you ask me, what is the national question? I think the issue of poverty, the issue of economic underdevelopment, the issue of political reform, the issue of nation building, those are key. Those are key. Quite clearly, ZANU-PF is part of the problem, but also part of the solution. So you can't ignore them. They will have to be on that table as well. And having been a negotiator for the MDC since 2007, I have no doubt that the work we had started, the dialogue, if that had been allowed to continue, we would actually have gotten to somewhere where you can say Zimbabweans are on an irreversible and an irrevocable path to sustainability. Number two, I also think that one of Africa's greatest failures has been the fact that we have put so much faith in what I can describe as little big men. Little big men. They're big men, all right. Mobutu Sese Seko was a very big man. within the context of Zaire. Robert Mugabe is a very big man. Siad Barre is a very big man. Wofet Bwinyi is a very big man. The late and great Mwalimu Nyerere of Tanzania was a very big man. I can go on and on and on and on. But these big men are very little when it comes to the question of sustainable vision, the question of constructing their countries on a sustainable agenda of development, of growth, of inclusivity. And as a result, you have had states on the African continent that have almost been what you can call, for lack of a better word, states in permanent crisis. So these are states that are in constant crisis, which is interrupted regularly by a period of normalcy. Zimbabwe is a good example. And part of the problem lies in these predatory little big men. So talking about individuals, I think, is a misnomer within the context of Africa, because these little big men have failed us. On the question of the economic opportunities, there are massive economic opportunities in Zimbabwe. Massive. Even now, when the economic the political situation is very turbulent. I think that it's an investment destination which no one can ignore, and which no one should ignore. But investment in Africa is not a short-term experience. So you can't go in Africa, you can't go in Zimbabwe with a short-term mindset. Investment in Africa must be predicated on a long-term mindset, fully aware of the challenges, not just in Zimbabwe, but in Africa as well. There are fantastic assets in the commodity sector, in the mining sector, in the financial service sector. There's so much potential. One of Zimbabwe's greatest assets is these people. We are a very educated a group of people, very hardworking. We are in the center of Southern Africa. We've got backward-forward linkages with the rest of the region. But we have got also our own known challenges. But people are investing there. People are investing. The Chinese are investing in Zimbabwe. The South Africans are investing in Zimbabwe. The Indians are investing in Zimbabwe. And believe it or not, the United Kingdom is still the biggest investor in Zimbabwe. So it's a question of adopting a mindset focused on three things. Number one, it has to be a long-term mindset. Number two, I think it has to be an investment model that creates spatial linkages with the communities. Your focus can't be just a quick return. The communities as well, creating forward and backward linkages with the communities is very key. Number three, you have to know your environment. Africa is a very difficult place to be, so you have to know your environment. So you have to be a knowledge-based and a knowledge-driven investor, because what exists in this part of the world and what exists in Africa is very different. On my own experiences, your question, I think this is a very useful break away from Zimbabwe, and the work I'm doing here allows me to think, to research. It's a good environment. It's nice to take a step back and just reflecting. As I said before, Zimbabwe is a very difficult place to be. Just your ordinary reproduction is a challenge. With regards to my political work, I think that Zimbabwean politics needs some renaissance, needs some renewal. We have to learn to work together. and to work together, not on the basis of slogans, particularly the slogan that says Mugabe must go. It's a tired slogan. I think the slogan we need are slogans based on issues. What are we saying on the basis of the economy, the vision that I was talking about? And these are much bigger issues than intra-party political differences. And unfortunately, African politics has never gone beyond binary narratives. Those in power must go, those in the opposition must come in. And because it has been extractive binary politics, there's been no difference between the opposition and the party it is seeking to reflect. And we have not been held by the fact that our transitions have either been delayed or arrested. So I think we need a new narrative, a new discourse that focuses on key issues, that speaks to people's concerns, the issue of jobs, the issue of development, the issue of the environment, the issue of integration, the issue of the vision that I keep on harping about. And that's what we're trying to do.
Okay, we'll take 3 more questions. Yes, yes, and yes.
I'm Gary Kleiman, an independent emerging financial markets analyst with a number of clients investing in Africa, and certainly have taken a look at least at Zimbabwe fairly recently. And I want to ask you, in terms of the specifics of the SMP and the potential pressure points that might be there that could force that political change, whether it's positive in terms of good intention or out of crisis urgency, some sort of unity effort. I want to point to 3 separate areas. First is the Chinese borrowing. We know that the Exim Bank and others are withdrawing lines globally. The other would be the financial sector. A number of banks, I guess about half the banks, have either been merged or consolidated. There's still the central bank that has to be recapitalized. There's supposed to be a central asset management agency launched. And finally, of course, the Indonesian bill is supposed to be clarified, I guess, in the next few months, but a lot of key foreign direct investors are still threatening to pull out. Do you see any of those particular vulnerabilities being perhaps particularly outsized at this time, and could it force, that political unification out of desperation, if nothing else?
Hi, thanks very much. My name is Douglas Coltart. I'm a Zimbabwean lawyer based at the International Republican Institute at the moment. Mr. Biti, when you were a part of the GNU, you were quite vocal about the need for Western nations to remove sanctions. So my question is, to what extent has your view changed now that ZANU-PF is now firmly in power? And do you think that a revision perhaps of the benchmarks to be set for the Zimbabwe government to meet, updated maybe under the current circumstances with, for example, a realignment of the laws to the new constitution, something along those lines? To what extent could new benchmarks, do you think, could be used to entice ZANU-PF, given the tight position that they're in at the moment, to actually implement some of those reforms? Thanks.
Over there.
Thanks very much for your thoughts, Mr. Biti. It's fascinating to hear the reflections on somebody who's actually been there, and really the largest sort of financial crisis, domestic financial crisis of the last sort of 40 years in Zimbabwe. My name is Elliot Pence. I work at an advisory firm. We're in the final stages of a sort of long, arduous due diligence process on an acquisition in Zimbabwe. One of the major key issues is U.S. sanctions on Zimbabwe assets and key personalities. I'm wondering if you have any reflections on U.S. Zimbabwe relations going forward.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think that think that I think I've lost the mic. I think that there is so much that needs to be done on the economic front. But in order of priority, I would say that the issue of reviving the productive sector is key. But whoever is finance minister and whatever the government that is there, you have to multitask. You have no luxury of time. So you have to do a lot of things. So I want to deal with the first question, the first issue, that of the staff monitoring program, the SMP. As I said before, this is a key issue for Zimbabwe. If we were to write top 10 priorities of Zimbabwe, this would have to be in the top 5, the issue of Zimbabwe's debt. The biggest challenge to the SMP is political commitment. The Zimbabwean government runs on a silo approach, on a balkanized approach. I have no doubt about the commitment of the Minister of Finance in understanding the obligation and the imperative of the SMP. But I have also no doubt that the rest of government, they are totally oblivious to the importance of the SMP. So the Minister of Finance, the current one, just as I found out, you actually find that you are a lone ranger trying to push an array of reforms and drive the economy. So the lack of political will is going to always be a challenge. And that political will then have a multiply effect on the actual programs, or if you like, I don't like to use the word conditions, but the commitments that Zimbabwe has to meet in terms of the SMP. So I want to give you just one commitment, the commitment which was in the original SMP, which we actually did not meet, but the fund says we met, so it's all well and good, which is the issue of the primary balance. We were supposed to maintain a primary balance, which is basically a budget balance plus your interest payments to countries like China, etc. We actually didn't meet that. The 2013 budget had a deficit of over 14%. The current budget will have a deficit of over 27%. So we didn't meet any budget. We are not collecting revenues. That we are not meeting the target. So we had to revise the revenue target from $4.2 billion to $3.8 billion. That's 7% revision. Yet on the expenditure lines, we had to revise the expenditure figures upwards from 4.2 to 5.2 billion, an increase of 37%. So that is going to be a key downward risk on the SMP. One of the requirements as well is transparency around diamond revenues. We've been talking about a new Diamond Act, a diamond policy. I know that we'll be talking about it until the chickens come home to roost. So the way I see it is that because there's actually no commitment with the rest of the government, the targets will not be met. And I fear the Sudan situation, that you go into successor SMP, but you are not able to graduate to actually a program with the fund and with the donors. And I see a situation where because no donor is being asked to make a commitment, the the IMF will be happy to go along with the lie of a program after a program. And we, Zimbabwe, also say, oh, we are complying, but we are not really complying. And that's the risk that I see. I fear a reproduction of the Sudan situation. On the financial services sector, I think there are a number of challenges. The first challenge is obviously that of oversight and regulation. We have to strengthen our oversight and the regulatory framework. Number two is the issue of the lender of last resort at the central bank. Number three is non-performing loans, which are really toxic assets that are sitting in the banking sector. Number four is the undercapitalization of the smaller banks. We've got about 4 vibrant banks which are foreign owned. The rest are undercapitalized, and many of them are struggling. So we need bold decisions on that score. Number 5 is just the liquidity situation. There's just no money in the system. And I'm using, there's just no money in the system. And part of the problem is that we have no savings in Zimbabwe. A developing country like Zimbabwe, you need savings that are at least 40 to 50% of your GDP. At the present moment, we actually have negative savings. In fact, the very fact that we actually don't have savings account in Zimbabwe is an indictment. On the question of the Indigenization Act, I think the government is just fudging. There's no clarity that is required other than just repealing the act. It's not saving anyone. On the ground, the Indigenization Act is not stopping anyone from investing, because you just go to a minister, you get concessions, you get exemptions. But once a law is now being applied subjectively, it ceases to be a law. So for all intents and purposes, the Indigenization Act ceases to be a law. So repeal it, because a law is, the requirements of a law is that it's certain and it's applied consistently. The Indigenization Act is not being applied openly, transparently, and consistently. So repeal it. I don't think, but unfortunately, I don't think that there will be political courage to actually repeal the Indigenization Act. Zimbabwe needs foreign direct investment. In the first half of the year, we had $67 million as foreign direct investment. Zambia at the same period at $2 billion. Mozambique at the same period at close to $5 billion. So it's simply not good enough. On the question, Mr. Coulter's question on engagement, there is no country that will ever develop if it's a pariah, isolated little banana republic. There has to be engagement. I think the key question is, what form of engagement? What form of engagement? And in my respectful condition, it has to be strategic engagement. Strategic engagement. And this engagement takes the form, takes various forms. Surely there has to be engagement with the citizens. In a situation like Zimbabwe, where the state is actually withdrawn and the state doesn't have capacity to look after its citizens, the international community has always engaged in humanitarian obligations. So that's a form of engagement. And it's impossible to engage on a humanitarian platform without engaging the government. The donor people who are here know that if you have to feed Zimbabweans through the WFP, the government of the day must be involved. If you have to provide drugs for our hospitals, the Minister of Health must be involved. So that's engagement. But ultimately, you are engaging with the citizens. Strategic engagement, we are in an SMP. In SMP, there's no better engagement than that. There's no better engagement than that. And the good thing about the SMP is it actually also allows political engagement, which is actually key and missing in Zimbabwe. It's very stupid for us to go and be known every September that we go to the UN General Assembly and show to the world our capacity to shout expletives at every country in the world. That's not good enough. That's not good enough. And we behave as if we have got patent over bad words and bad language. That's not good enough. But I think the kind of engagement that is needed is one that focuses on the developmental agenda, and that's the beauty of the SMP. That's the beauty of the SMP. And in that dialogue, surely there must be quid pro quos. Surely it can be a one-way street. So the issues of you ask about benchmarks, the issues of the Constitution, compliance with the Constitution. It's an obvious issue that has to be on the agenda of any serious dialogue between Zimbabwe and its foreign friends or partners. The issue of the rule of law, the issue of violence, those clearly must be inevitable agendas. The danger is extreme positions. The danger is extreme positions. I see, and this is the position that is prevailing right now, I see a situation where there is an exuberance to engage the Zimbabwean government, but on what I will call, for lack of a better word, soft issues in that they don't prick the conscience. So in Harare at the present moment, everyone is talking about the SMP. Countries are sending experts on the sovereign wealth fund, on debt, and so forth. Well and good, but this is still a country where violence is the order of the day, where the rule of law is problematic. So you can't commit to engage on one set of issues and not another set of issues. It has to be the full monty. Equally, a situation where there's engagement purely on humanitarian issues, democratization issues, without other developmental issues is not. It doesn't help anyone. It doesn't help anyone. One of my experiences in government is that you need strong institutions. You really need strong institutions. You need a strong government, not in terms of its capacity to bully its citizens, to cause fear into its citizens, but a strong government in terms of its capacity to deliver to its people. So technical issues like a functional public finance management office is key. Having computers and software systems that actually work in government is key. So the issue of technical assistance, the issue of capacitating government ministries, the Ministry of Health is key, and that's a form of engagement. That's a form of engagement which is so key, and it's part of nation building. The challenge, I think, with international community at the present moment is that you have a situation where there's no clarity on why you want to. There's no clarity in foreign policy. There's no clarity, perhaps no leadership in terms of a clearly articulated forms of engagement and why there is to be engagement. So at the end of the day, you have got a vacuum. And the net result of that vacuum is that you have got seriously eclectic approaches that are being played out in Harare at the present moment. That doesn't benefit anyone. And I think that is what the challenge is. You ask about the US. I think, for me, I think that I don't want to delve into domestic politics, so I will be a diplomat. there has to be form and substance in any foreign policy. That form and substance must be very clear. Part of my biggest regret at the present moment is that that form and clarity is not there at all. From where we sit in 15,000 miles from here. And I think one of our biggest challenges at the present moment is that international law has never been as weak as it is at the present moment. International law is a set of rules and principles that has existed since modern states existed. And part of that international law, which has been refined over and over again, and people like Harry Truman understood this very, very well, is the deterrence component of international law. I'm not advocating for bombing of people and so forth, because that too has got problems and that too doesn't work. But the deterrence component of international law. Now, when you live in a situation where there has been a liquidation of the deterrence component of the international law, it creates impunity, a culture of impunity. So it creates this, the flourishing of these little big men that trounce on rights, on their citizens' rights, left, right, and center. So part of the re-emergence, as it were, of these dictatorial elements on the African continent, and it's not just on the African continent, you see it in the Middle East. And part of the growth as well of many of these undemocratic movements, the Boko Harams, the Al-Shabaabs and so forth, is a challenge, is a spillover from a very unclear foreign policy, a very unclear foreign policy. And the weakening of international law as we have always known it, namely a set of rules that provides for do's and don'ts and provides this deterrent component. So to me, I see that as a big omission. I see that as a big challenge.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for, so I'm going to let Todd wrap up.
Great. So thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Tendai. You noticed Tendai mentioned a couple of times a paper. He's just finishing an essay that talks about his own experience. We'll have that up on the CGD website early next year. Hopefully all of you will see it. If you're not on our newsletter, you can sign up online, or you can drop a business card at our front desk, and we'll put you on the newsletter. But please join me in thanking Caroline and Tendai for this morning.